Welcome back to the Psalm 40 Project. We're continuing our interview with Dave Buter. So, being here for an extended period of time, are there some events that have shaped your faith? And somewhat in particular, how has LaGrave sort of played a role in that?
This church has changed in its membership so much since the mid-'80s. There's probably many members who were not aware of the experience this church had with my daughter Ann in the mid-1980s. She had brain cancer, developed that in 1985, and died in 1986. She was 9 years old when she died. And that was obviously a catastrophic event for our family, but for this church family, for the extended LaGrave community, for the Seymour Christian School community. All of those got involved in such a supportive way that it's hard to describe how much that means to me in my faith walk. To see the faithfulness, the support of a church family, of a school family, and of course of my immediate family also, has had a huge influence on my life. There's many members still at LaGrave who remember that experience, and there was truly a sense for the entire church, I think, that we were all in this together. And to that extent, it was an experience that I will never forget, and will always be grateful to this church for what they did for my family. That's not to say that experience in and of itself strengthened my faith at the time. There were so many questions and so many obstacles we faced and so much confusion. But then again, as I look back on it, we also at that time as a family said, how are we ever going to get through this? How are we ever going to be happy again? And through grace and through support, pastoral support, member support, community support, here we are as a functioning family. And that in and of itself almost feels like a miracle sometimes. When you think of where we were for a while. So that has certainly influenced where my family is with this church. We're forever indebted. I also, in terms of my faith journey, have learned a whole lot from my children and my grandchildren. And it demonstrates again that this faith journey thing isn't just looking back to your formative years. It's sort of a never-ending walk, I think, because I'm learning more and being inspired more by what my children are doing, what they did as youngsters when they were in the school or in this church singing the songs of the church. When I see my grandchildren do the same, when I'm singing in church with my granddaughter Quinn, and she's getting into it, singing with a great deal of passion, it's very uplifting, and it demonstrates to me God's faithfulness from generation to generation.
Well, both of those stories are amazing to hear, and I'm sure that there are I hope that many people feel the same way that you guys have felt, both supported but also being able to witness the faithfulness from generation to generation. With those relationships that you've built, are there, maybe one or two people, two or three people maybe, that have really impacted your faith?
I mentioned Reverend Epping already. And yes, he would be one I would think of, although when you ask that question, we always tend to look back to when we were children thinking, well, our faith development took place then, and that's when it happened. I'm still feeling that I'm very early on my faith walk, and there's
okay.
all sorts of things that are happening now. And so, although I reference some from my childhood, my current pastors are hugely influential in my faith walk. But Reverend Eppinger, as I said, for a kid, thinking of him as your pastoral minister, but also as a person who's really interested in your development. That was important to me. My dad taught me a great deal about the value of the institutional church, and I mean that in an extended sense, not just LaGrave, but the institutions that LaGrave would sponsor, Christian education, Wedgwood. He taught me the importance of the institution, and that a part of service is being willing to be a leader if that's your calling, to be willing to lead in that church or in that school. I view him during a period of time as sort of Mr. LaGrave. He really had a passion for this church and had a passion for Christian education. And I learned some of that passion for institutions from him. My mom was less into institutions. In fact, she was always trying to look for ways to do an end run around some of the institutional rules. But she was so concerned about people. She was so concerned about the family of LaGrave. She was so concerned about the families at Seymour Christian School where I grew up. She wanted to make sure that anyone who had a need, she knew of it and she was able to address it. So that's a good combination of mentoring, the institution, and then the members of that institution.
Caring about the people
too.
So with your members or your mentors sort of in mind, are there things that are happening in the church, LaGrave, that they would be excited about?
I would think of my dad. He would be excited about the involvement of women in the life of the church. Women in leadership roles, women in pastoral roles. That was a dream of his as far back as the 60s and 70s. I remember him talking about that. He talked about the talent in the church that, in his opinion, wasn't being used. And to that extent, maybe he was ahead of his time on that issue. With both Eppinger and my dad, they would love to see that this church has never wavered in its commitment to Christian education. That was a passion for each of them, and I think it remains a passion for this church. And that's important. For my mom, she would love to see the role of the pastoral care assistants. It's an organized way of doing what she was doing on her own, and so probably more effective than what she was doing, but it's the same theme, the same goal.
I get to hear stories of people while I do these interviews, and it's just so cool to see the history of the institution of LaGrave. Both stay true, but at the same time, it finds areas to grow within those things that they're staying true to.
Yes.